Hey everyone, so we are moving on from more learned behaviors to incentives. So in this first video, we will cover um, what incentives are and certain variables that can influence how valuable these incentives are to us, such as the amount of the incentive, its valence, and our proximity to the incentive. And then we'll get into intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation and flow. I think I can actually consolidate these two and make combine them into one video without making that video too long. And so I will probably do that, but I'm not positive. So I'll let you know when that video starts. But incentives. So these are external stimuli that motivate behavior. There are two basic kinds of incentives. One type is positive. So this motivates behavior to try and go attain that incentive. So an example of this is a positive incentive would be vacation, where we are trying to save money, right? That's the behavior to go and attain this incentive of going on a vacation. A negative incentive motivates behavior to avoid that incentive. That's something that we don't want. So we don't want to crash. So oftentimes, not always, oftentimes though, we will avoid behaviors like drinking and driving that make that negative incentive of crashing more probable. You might be thinking this sounds pretty similar to reward and punishment. It definitely does sound similar, but it differs from incentives differ from reward and punishment in that this involves anticipation. So, right, with Skinner and the law of effect and all of that, it's all just okay. We get this reward or punishment, and that just directly influences behavior. And that's it. We're not including psychological processes, but with incentives, we do include psychological processes and cognitions to include expectations and anticipations for whether we're going to get a certain reward or punishment or not. With this, we see things like loss aversion, where we definitely, as humans, tend to hate losses more than we like equivalent gain. So, by that, I just mean we will often really dislike losing $5 more than we would like gaining $5. Yeah. So, one variable that influences how impressive, I guess, that incentive seems to us is the amount of that incentive. So a common incentive, a positive incentive for us humans is payment, right? And so in this study, just an example supporting this idea of incentive amount influencing the value of that incentive, there was an intervention to try and get people to smoke less. And so on the y-axis here, we just have a measure of how often they smoked. And then on the x-axis here, we have low magnitude intervention. So this is where participants were only given $40, and then a high magnitude intervention where were given $80. Additionally, we have a baseline and then intervention, and then back to baseline, where they again just don't get paid after the intervention. And same thing for the high magnitude here. And basically what was found was that we like large incentives, large positive incentives, that is, and these larger incentives act as better motivators. And so when participants were paid in this $80 intervention, right, we see less smoking behaviors than when they were only incentivized with $40. Other variables that can influence incentive value have to do with context. And so this, again, is a large part of just cognitive psychology, but context and what's going around the area of that incentive, whatever it is, also plays a large role in how we perceive the value of that incentive. So This isn't directly incentives, but just to kind of give you an example of what context effects look like. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. And so what this is basically just a task where people are asked to state which circle is larger, circle A and circle B. And not always, but pretty commonly, people will say that circle B is larger, even though they're actually the same size. And that just has to do with context, right? It has to do with the circles that are around the other circle in question. This has also, there's this dress illusion that was pretty popular a few years ago. So this is just another example of context and how we perceive the color of this dress depends on the context. And so if we perceive that light is falling on the dress, we see blue and black, versus if we perceive that shadow is falling on the dress, we see it as white and yellow. Unless you're partially colorblind like me, then it doesn't matter too much. But anyways, a very common context effect is contrast effects. And so this can work in two ways. There can be positive contrast, where this is going from a small to a large reward. So this can look like a pay raise. We like positive contrasts quite a bit. Versus negative contrast, this is where we go from a larger incentive to a smaller incentive, and this can look like a pay cut. And so just for an example of that, and the takeaway is that contrast comparison matters. So if we start with getting paid $5 for whatever it is, maybe mowing the lawn or something, and then we later on get offered $8 to do the same task, we're going to be pretty happy about that. Versus if we're initially offered $5 and then we end up being offered $2, not so happy about that. So we're going to go over a study regarding paying rats. I like the idea of paying rats with food pellets. And again, back with the rats, right? Our favorite psychology study animal. It actually, after going through all this behavioral psychology research, makes you feel behavioral and cognitive psychology research makes you feel quite bad for these rats. But anyways, so we have two different sections here. This is just trial on the x-axis and running speed. So again, rats going through a maze, another one of these studies. But anyways, they were rewarded for going through the maze with food pellets. So in this first part, before the shift, they were either offered 256, a lot of pellets, 16 pellets, or 1 pellet for going through this maze. So those who were offered 1 pellet, they go pretty slow, like, right? And it's just like, it's 1 pellet of food. That's not very motivating. I'm going to just kind of walk or jog over there. Versus those who get 16 go a little faster. Those who get 256 go really fast. Like, oh my God, that's a lot of food. I'm going to race on over there through the maze and get the food. However, of interest here is after the shift. And so after the shift, all rats just get 16 pellets for getting to the end of the maze. Those who initially got 1 start going really fast, right? They're like, oh, this is 16 times better. I'm going to go get that food. Versus let me see, about the same speed here for those who initially got the 16 pellets, and those who initially got the 256 were like, screw this, only 16 pellets. I'm not doing that. So yeah, just to emphasize this contrast effect here. Additionally, more evidence of expectations serving as a comparison standard. And so going from behavior with rats to expectations here, we see similar findings. And so with this study, students were either went into a class either expecting an A or expecting a C, and then they either received an A or received a C, and then happiness level was measured for that. And so based on contrast effects and comparisons, those who expected a C initially were quite a bit happier, right? Both when they received a C, because they matched expectations, versus if they expected an A, they're really not happy with that because that fell below their initial expectations. Versus we get really happy when we exceed our expectations. So when those who expected a C received an A, versus those who expected an A and received an A. This met their expectations, so still pretty happy, but not as happy as those who expected a C and ended up receiving that A. A couple other factors that I want to talk about that influence the value of incentives are valence and distance. So valence, you can kind of just think of this as positive or negative or good or bad. Distance is literally just the proximity, the distance to the incentive. So this is like if you're using a cookie as an incentive, that might be more incentivizing if the cookie or if the bakery is a 2-minute walk away versus if it's 10 miles away, right? So that's the idea of distance. We have a tendency to approach or avoid more, or that tendency is increased as the avoid becomes closer. In other words, we feel more motivated to go and get that incentive as it's closer. We see this commonly in academia, right, with things like procrastination. So either going towards that incentive of an A or trying to avoid that incentive of a bad grade becomes a lot more motivating when it's closer in proximity. And that's at least one explanation of procrastination. Interestingly, the gradient of avoidance seems to be stronger than the gradient of approach. And we'll go over a study on the next slide that is an example of that. And so there's a stronger influence of distance for anticipated punishment relative to anticipated reward. Oops. All right, so an example of that in this study, once again, rats. And once again, there's the possibility of the rat getting shocked, poor little rats. So just consider that there's a corridor where there is where there is food on one side or a shock on the side, and the value of that incentive is varied. So varied the time of the last meal, additionally varied the strength of the shock, additionally the just distance proximity of the rat to either the shock or the food was manipulated as well. And then what was measured was how fast that rat ran. So we see the expected effect of distance, right? The closer the rat is to either the food or the shock, which is what we see on the x-axis here, especially for the shock, the faster the rat ran. So this is the gradient stronger for that avoidance behavior, right? Avoiding the shock. They were really running fast here, especially for that strong shock. And there was some effect of food here, right? Where deprivation, those rats who had been deprived of food ran quite a bit faster, whereas those who had only been deprived for 1 hour didn't really seem to care too much. But there was, again, that stronger gradient for the avoidance behavior. Proximity didn't matter quite as much for the avoidance behavior, going and getting that food even when deprived for 48 hours. Kind of a more recent demonstration of this distancing effect, and one that's actually in humans, is that we have the ability to, and oftentimes do, distance ourselves from anger-inducing events or just events that make us feel bad in general. So yeah, we do this psychological distancing to reduce emotional reactions. And so in this study, which this graph on the right comes from, there was a competitor making obnoxious comments. You can think about this as trash talk. And there were 3 different conditions. There was a condition where participants were told to self-immersion and think as if that was the event of the obnoxious behavior was happening again. or there was a control group, or there was another condition where participants were instructed to do this self-distancing, which just basically looks like common instructions are: think back on this as if you are of a third party, like you weren't the target of this initial comment, and try and look at it from more of a distance and objective and neutral perspective. And again, one of my favorite social psych dependent variables is this aggressive measure where you can blast that person with a noise that's really annoying. And so you can determine how loud that annoying noise is. And what we see is that when distance, there's less emotional and behavioral, less negative emotional and behavioral reactions here. And so overall, just less aggressive behavior when we distance ourselves from what can be seen in this example as a negative incentive, something that we want to avoid. All right, so that's it. Again, in the next video, we'll be going over intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation and float.